It's the morning of May 18th, 2009. I'm Michael Aron of NJN News. We're here at the Rutgers Eagleton Institute of Politics for the Rutgers program on the governor, the Brendan T. Byrne Archive. This morning we're going to talk to Tom Byrne. Tom is the oldest of 7 children of Brendan Byrne. He has also been pretty active in state politics. He served as chairman of the Democratic State Committee in the 1990s. He has been mentioned as a candidate for office over the years. He is an investment advisor based in Princeton, and it'll be interesting to hear what the Byrne governorship looked like from the vantage point of his oldest son. Tom, how old were you when your father became governor?
19.
What were you doing in life at age 19?
Well, I was an undergraduate at Princeton, and I applied there thinking I'd be an hour away from home, and that would be good enough, and all of a sudden the folks moved in across the street.
Had you worked in your father's campaign?
Yeah, I did.
What did you do?
I worked in both campaigns. In the first one, just more a volunteer around headquarters and so on. And in the second campaign, I was much more active. I was 23, and I did a lot of surrogate speaking and just other stuff around headquarters. So, and I think my father by that time listened to me a little bit on some political advice. So, I had a pretty interesting role in '77, informal but interesting.
Surrogate speaking, you in fact are Brendan T. Byrne Jr.
Yes.
But he's called Brendan and you're called Tom.
Correct.
What were you doing when your father first thought about running for governor? Were you a freshman in college?
Yeah, well, what happened is, if you want to go all the way back, the fall of 1972, whatever, I was applying to college, and my father was a Superior Court judge. And, not too many Superior Court judges become governor 2 years later. So, I went to West Orange High School, graduated, got into Princeton, went, and, I was a basic student like anybody else. And all of a sudden, life changed. And, the other thing that is that my father had not been an elected official before. So it may have been a bigger change for us than some others. I've had people say to me over the years that, boy, it must have been weird or whatever growing up with your father out of the house all the time as a politician. And the answer is, well, he really wasn't out of the house all the time because he didn't climb the ladder in a variety of elected offices like so many other people did. So, my life was pretty normal.
What kind of father was he when you were young?
I think pretty normal father, good father. I mean, we used to go to Yankee Stadium. He'd take us there, take me and friends there for birthdays and just other games. He was a big baseball fan. We'd play sports out in the yard.
What sports?
Baseball, football, stuff like that. Basketball. My father loved to play basketball, and it was pretty good. He had a decent shot, he was a good tennis player. We didn't play that much tennis together. We played more of the other sports together, but I guess we both like sports, so we did a lot of the kind of normal stuff when I was a kid. If you ask my youngest sibling, I think you get a different answer because my father's time was much different once he was in the governorship.
Who is your youngest sibling?
Billy.
How old is he?
I think he was 3 when my father got elected.
And your mother is Jean Byrne?
Yeah.
And she's the mother of all 7 of Brendan's children?
Yeah.
And you grew up in West Orange?
Yes.
And your father's various jobs before judge, prosecutor?
Well, yeah. I mean, it didn't happen quite as simply as I made it sound. I mean, my father had a variety of high-profile jobs, just none of them were elected. And so when I was a real little guy, he worked for then-Governor Minor. And I guess his highest position there was called Executive Secretary, which I think is pretty much the same thing as Chief of Staff now. And I remember going down to Trenton with him. I was, 4 or 5 years old, just to like a Christmas party or whatever. And I can remember driving down Route 1 when there was nothing on it, and it was an easy drive. And then he was Essex County prosecutor for I think about 9 years. And that was in Newark, so close by and home at a reasonable hour and all that sort of thing. And I remember that he was prosecutor during the Newark riots, and I remember listening to transmissions on the police radio we had in the car and so on. It maybe affected my life in minor ways. I mean, there were certain parties that I wasn't invited to in high school because my father was the prosecutor, but that was okay with me. And so anyway, then he went on. He went on during the Hughes administration to become on what's now the Board of Public Utilities, and it was called the PUC, the Public Utility Commission. He was president of that, and I remember going to Morven for the first time to. The whole family gets to meet Governor Hughes, and I was told to behave, and it seemed like a really big house and all that kind of thing. And then when Governor Cahill became governor, he was appointed to the Superior Court and was a judge. And my father has a real love for the law, and I think was very happy on the bench. And once said to me that if he had been appointed to the Supreme Court, he might never have left. Politics might not have been that tempting. But as it was, he was a Superior Court judge. And, I guess we'll get into it, but when the opportunity came to run, that's what happened.
Well, I would like to get into that right now. What caused him to morph from a judge into a candidate for governor?
I think circumstance. Look, he was always interested in politics, and as I say, he had worked in the State House for Bob Miner and so on, and had a mind, obviously, a great mind for law, a mind for politics and policy, and just a series of circumstances, which he once described to me as 100 to 1, occurred, which is to say there were some scandals in Trenton. Involving a couple of Governor Cahill's cabinet members. No fault of the governor's, but it happened. And Watergate started brewing nationally at the same time. And I think Democratic Party leaders in the state who had assumed Cahill was a shoo-in for re-election started to think if we get ourselves a credible candidate, we could actually pull this off. And of course, as I'm sure others have discussed by now, there were the FBI tapes describing my father as a guy who couldn't be bought and all that kind of stuff. So between that public perception, the man who couldn't be bought, and the view of maybe 200 opinion leaders around the state, or at least in the Democratic Party, that this was a bright, competent, experienced guy, it all came together.
Were you surprised when you learned that he was going to run for governor?
Probably surprised, probably not shocked. But as I say, I do remember applying to college with no thought that my family would be moving to town. And, I still wonder would I have applied to Princeton if I knew my folks were going to be living across the street. As it turned out, those were sort of unwarranted fears. It was actually kind of neat in some ways because I could go home if there was something interesting going on at Morven. And other than that, I had my own life in college as I would have anywhere else. But to answer your question, sure, I was surprised because I distinctly remember the period of time and applying thinking I was going away from home, and then home followed.
Were there any hints that you can recall before '73 of your father considering a run for higher office, U.S. Senate, for example?
Sure, there were hints. There was a small group of people who had actually printed up Byrne for Senate signs, maybe back in 1970, I forget the year. So, yeah, there were hints. And at the same time, I remember my dad telling me once that when Bob Miner sought the governorship back in 1969 against Cahill and lost, my father told me he figured he might be Attorney General had Miner won, and figured that his political career was probably over. And so that story's been told 1,000 times in different ways, that just a lot of unexpected things happen in politics and in life.
So when he moved to Morven in, I assume, January of '74, were you in the middle of your sophomore?
Yes, sophomore year.
Sophomore year.
Right.
And for those who don't know, Morven is probably a quarter of a mile or less from the quad of Princeton University.
That's right.
What would cause you to, how often would you cross this Route 206 and see your family?
I would go home once a week because the Catholic chaplaincy at Princeton was right next door to Morven. So I would usually go to church and then go home and read the Sunday papers, get a bite to eat, and go back. So I would be home for an hour a week, basically.
How disruptive was it for your siblings to leave West Orange and move into what was then the governor's mansion?
I don't know if it was really disruptive. I mean, it's not like we're the only family that moved because Dad changed jobs. Yeah, I'm the only one in the family who did not go to Princeton High School. The others graduated from there, so they went through the normal stuff of being the new kid in class, and probably with more people knowing who they were and getting driven to school, I guess, and stuff like that. I don't know if disruption is the right word. Certainly changes, but I think my siblings will all agree that they were very interesting changes.
How was Morven physically for a large family?
I liked it. I loved being there. I mean, the house to me was first of all very historic and pretty, and great grounds, and had a nice swimming pool and tennis court in the backyard. My mother might give you a different answer because she thought it was less homey, and she's more of a private person and maybe didn't like as many people she didn't know traipsing through her house. I mean, that's very different when you live in a public house. That never particularly bothered me, but then again, it was never really my house. I just dropped in occasionally.
Was she an eager participant in the run for governor, a willing participant, or a reluctant participant?
I would say willing in 1973 and eager in 1977. The difference is that she was proud of her husband's record, knew that he was an underdog and knew that he was getting criticized and thought a lot of it was unwarranted, and that really energized her in the second campaign. Having said that, my mother is not, I've never heard her described as a political animal. I mean, my friends love my mother and think she's a great lady, but I wouldn't say that politics is particularly in her blood.
Your father took on the income tax fight in his first term.
Yeah.
From other interviews we've done for this archive, it appears as if that dominated the entire first term.
Oh, I think it did.
Did it?
Yeah, I think so. I remember, early on, maybe the first crisis he faced was a gas crisis, where there were shortages. They implemented odd even lines and all that sort of thing, and people thought, well, this guy seems to be on top of things, and I remember his poll ratings being pretty good, and all of a sudden, the income tax proposal goes down and poll ratings plummeted, and it absolutely did dominate the first term, and it was a long fight. It didn't happen overnight. A lot of times the bill's introduced in the legislature, and 6 months you know the answer. And this went on for, I guess, basically 2 years, and it obviously affected his standing, political capital, and so forth. So, I don't think there's any question that it dominated his first term.
What was the effect on the family of the criticisms that he endured for fighting for an income tax?
It may have varied by person. I can really only speak for myself there, Michael. I mean, it's not like I sat around commiserating with my siblings going, gee, poor Dad, what are we going to do to up his popularity? I mean, there's none of that. And it honestly didn't bother me that much. I mean, maybe because I have thick skin, maybe because I was more worried about, passing some course at Princeton, I don't know. So, look, I knew he was unpopular. I felt he was fighting for the right things, and I think I instinctively, at a pretty young age, just understood the vicissitudes of politics.
You agreed then that the state needed an income tax?
Yeah, I mean, I was taking public policy courses, and I certainly understood the basic principles then of tax regressivity, of the choking effect of too high property taxes on our urban areas, and the effect on education funding and things like that. So remember, at the time, there was maybe a consensus would be too strong a word, but there was a wide understanding in both political parties that an income tax was the right thing for New Jersey. It almost got passed, as those who know New Jersey history know, under the Hughes administration. Governor Cahill advocated for an income tax to no avail. And so this was an issue that had been percolating in the state for at least 10 years. And it happened, it passed on my father's watch.
Did your father talk issues at home?
Not that much, no. There were people who, there was press at the time that said Andrew Cuomo was one of his father's top issues advisors and all that, and I had no such role in my father's administration. In campaigns, I do think he listened to me a little bit more. I mean, I did give him some advice that I think he followed that may have been a minority opinion at the time I said it, but not in terms of issues, really.
Do you recall some advice you gave your father during a campaign?
Sure. I remember a meeting at the Princeton Club, had to be in early '77, where the meeting was called basically for some of his senior advisors to gently tell him that history would remember him kindly, that he fought for great causes, but that there was no way that he could win re-election later that year, and that he really ought to make way for somebody who could keep the Democratic Party alive.
You were at the meeting?
I was at the meeting, yeah. And so we're in the car on the way home, and he said, "What do you think?" And I think I had a pretty good analysis. I said, "Look," I said, "right now, you're so unpopular that every county in this state is going to have their own horse in the race. And they're all a bunch of grand duchies that don't talk to each other. And no one outside the home county is going to have heard any of these guys." I said, "So the vote is, you're the only one with a profile. The vote is going to break down as a pro-Byrne versus anti-Byrne vote. And as long as the anti-Byrne vote is whacked up in enough different ways, you'll win the primary." And that's what happened. And he won it with 28.4% of the vote, if I recall correctly.
Did he agree with your analysis, do you think?
He didn't. Well, he ran, so I guess so. He didn't say he agreed at the time. He just listened. And I went on to say, I said, once you have the nomination, I said, if you're anything, you're a great debater. He had been an outstanding prosecutor, and he has a great legal mind. And I said, once the issues are joined in a fall campaign, no one's going to out-debate you. And so once you're the nominee, a campaign takes on its own dynamic. And I said, once that's the case, I think you have a very good chance to win. So I think in a situation like that, yeah, he did listen to me. And I think in a couple other places as the campaign went on.
Staying with the income tax fight, you said that you have a thick skin. What about the impact on your younger siblings? Were they kidded at school about their father, for example?
Not that I've ever heard. I mean, maybe that happened to one of them and they came home and didn't really say anything about it. But I think when you're in high school or younger, and remember, at the beginning, Billy was 3, so that means he was only 11 when my father left office. So at that age, what do kids know about these issues? I mean, your father's the governor, and that's cool, and I think that was pretty much it for my siblings.
Is it cool or is it embarrassing?
Probably a little of each. I think it was probably a little bit embarrassing for them when they got dropped off, at school rather than ride the school bus. I think they got used to it. Yeah, state police.
For their security?
Yeah.
I want to ask you
at least that's what I remember.
I want to ask you about security at some point, but let's stay with a couple of the threads that we're on right now. Do you know if any of your family thought that he shouldn't run in 1977?
No, I don't think so. I think everybody was supportive. I mean, everybody was supportive. I don't think anybody had any question about him running.
I think we've been told that John Degnan was one of the few people in your father's inner circle who thought he should run for the election. Do you recall that?
Vaguely, yes. Yeah.
But the rest seem to have been on the other side of that
Just
issue.
thought, all loved him and all thought he was great, but just didn't think it was winnable.
Who were the key people around your father through his years as governor?
Well, I hate questions like that because I'm going to leave somebody out. It reminds me of the time when I was party chairman and I was at the podium at a dinner and I was introducing various people in the audience and people started pointing to an empty seat like I was supposed to know who was sitting there and introduce them. So, at any rate, John Degnan was certainly a key person around him and was Attorney General at some point during the administration, I forget the years. Dick Leone was manager of the first campaign and went on to be treasurer. Cliff Goldman was later treasurer. Luke Hayden was the first counsel. I think there were probably 8 chiefs of staff over the 8 years. Tough job, and there was natural turnover there. But I remember Harold Hodis and Bob Mulcahy toward the end of his time being very effective in those roles. Don Linke was head of policy and planning, and Henry Luther was the campaign manager in, I guess, the second campaign, and Bob Torricelli was the deputy campaign manager, and as a quite young guy, was a very good political tactician, and the two of them played key roles in that campaign. And yeah, there were a number of others. I mean, there were cabinet members who I think are still seen as really outstanding in their fields. I mean, a guy like Lou Gammaccini was considered just a superstar in the field of transportation. Joanne Finley, who recently passed away, was extremely innovative in the area of healthcare. This whole notion of diagnostic related groups that are now part of national healthcare policy started here. So one of the things I think my father's very proud of, and I am too, is that he, I think, attracted a lot of really outstanding talent into government. And I think part of that is because my father was the sort of guy who was not a micromanager, who basically said to you, "You're a smart guy, I trust you to run this, and there will be oversight from me, but you're a smart guy, it's your show." And I think that helped to attract people in, number one. And I think number two, there was a feeling that there was a real agenda, that this was a governor who really did want to change some things, and you weren't just in there as a manager. You were
a liberal agenda?
In some ways a liberal agenda. I guess you would call the change from a more regressive to a more progressive tax system liberal. I think you would call the preservation of the pine lands, I don't know if it's liberal or conservative or progressive or what. Maybe you'd say it was conservative in the sense of conservationist. But the point is, it was looking at things that needed to happen in New Jersey, whether the tax system or whether in a state this congested, this densely populated, there was a major initiative to fix transportation in the state. And so on all of these issues, there was a real agenda, and I think it attracted good people in because there were challenges they were going to actively deal with.
Do you think it was easier back then to attract good people into government than it is today?
In some ways, yeah, I think it was easier. I think there is an awful lot of scrutiny now of people that really reaches the absurd. As one, I was talking, this 10 years ago already, but I was talking to a criminal defense lawyer just at a cocktail party, and he said there are so many regulations that what gets people in trouble is often regulations that they never heard of. He called them tripwires. And I've been offered, asked if I would consider this or that post that is sort of a public post, and the degree of financial disclosure to me is almost frightening. What happens if I leave out some mutual fund that I own a little bit of, and just, so I do worry about it. I also worry about, untruths that are said about you that people presume because they read it in print. So I think it's tough. And at the same time, it's not like there wasn't any scrutiny back then. Somebody reminded me recently of the story of when we got a dog. And my father compared it to when Governor Minor got a dog. When Minor got a dog, the press all wrote, "Isn't that a cute little dog?" When we got a dog, they went next door to Borough Hall to make sure we'd properly registered the thing and got its tags. And so...
Had you?
Yep. So, yeah, I do think there's a hesitancy, and I think that we really do lose some talented people who just don't want to deal with the level of scrutiny that's out there today. I don't really think it has to do with money and compensation differences. I think there's a lot of people who'd be happy to come in if circumstances were a little different.
You say that when you got a dog, the press checked out whether it was properly licensed. There were some things during your father's administration that the press, during his 2 terms, that the press liked to go after. Out-of-state travel, use of state cars by family members.
Absolutely.
Tell us about those things from the point of view of the family.
Oh my goodness. Well, use of state cars was my poor sister Susan. I mean, she really did.
What happened?
Well, I guess she drove them out of state.
Did she use a state car?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I was away at college. I wasn't supervising her, but she did. I don't know all on what occasions, but yeah, she did. And it did come under criticism. And frankly, I think justifiably so, but Susan was Susan. And yeah, my father was criticized for using the helicopter. And there, I think, come on, the governor's schedule is busy. And yeah, if you're expected to be in Atlantic City for something at 10 a.m. and expected to be at a lunch in Hackensack, if people want the governor to get around, there are times you have to use that. And when I was party chairman and Christy Whitman was governor, I would just never criticize her for using the helicopter. Because I would say to reporters, just what I said. And at the same time, I think my father diffused the criticism pretty effectively and with humor. He got up at the Legislative Correspondents' Dinner one year and he says, "Look, guys, I'm aware of all this criticism." He says, "Well, what's this fellow supposed to do? If your daughter's got the car, you've got to use the helicopter." And it sort of brought the house down, and the instructive lesson in that is I really think the issue sort of went away after that. There were other criticisms to take the place of those, though.
What else was he criticized?
Oh, there was I remember a picture of him at I think it was a National Governors Conference, sitting by the side of a pool.
I swear I was going to ask you about a photograph in his bathing suit next.
Well, he maybe should have been indicted for poor choice of bathing suits. But beyond that, I mean, my goodness, because you're a public official, you can't take a swim or relax for 15 minutes? My father really did work pretty hard, but if you wanted to portray him as otherwise, you could. So he took a swim at a governor's conference. I mean, a lot of people go to conferences where they actually work, but take a break. And at any rate...
Was there something about the bathing suit?
Yeah, it was a bad bathing suit.
Too tight?
Yep.
How about security? You mentioned that your siblings were driven to Princeton High School by the state police security detail. How about you? You were on the campus half a mile away. Did you have any kind of security?
If anybody was following me, I didn't know about it, and there was nobody taking notes for me. So no, I really didn't have any security. But there was an issue there. When we first moved into Morven, there's no fence around the place or anything like that, and Christmas carolers would come up to the front door in December, and it was lovely. And then one day, and I don't remember what year, one of my younger brothers woke up in the morning, and this happened to Queen Elizabeth once in Buckingham Palace. There's a guy sitting on the foot of her bed, and the same thing happened at Morgan. And there was just a guy who I guess came up the fire escape and was in my brother's third floor bedroom, and he just got in the house. And needless to say, my mother freaked. I mean, you know, if it had been a different guy, could have been killed. Who knows? So after that, security got tightened up a little bit, and there was a fence and all that sort of thing. So you just never know. My point in saying that is, you know, all this concern about security wasn't without at least some valid reason, I guess.
Were there any threats against your father during the tax fight?
I think there were. And maybe that's one thing I was shielded from. I think there are probably more death threats against public officials than ever come out. Whether they're serious or not, I don't know. So I've been told that there were, and it's an area that I don't really have any details, and that's just as well.
Do you remember the election nights of 73 and 77?
Ironically, not that clearly. You know, it was situations where it was just a whirl of events, and it all happened so quickly that, you know, I don't have any particular memories that stand out. I was glad that he won.
You mentioned that your mother was proud of your father's record in the first term and wanted to see that vindicated in a second term. Did she play an active role of any kind in the 77 campaign?
Yes. My mother spoke a lot. We both were pretty active as surrogate speakers. And I remember that my mother wrote a letter to the editor, and I don't remember what it said, but basically addressing criticisms of him and saying they were unfair and that he'd done what needed to be done and so forth. As I say, I can't reconstruct the wording for you, but the letter in itself received a lot of attention and publicity and maybe changed some minds. It was a very good letter, and I suppose, you know, an unusual thing for a political spouse to do, but she just did it, and I don't know if she told anybody she did it. Yeah, she absolutely played an active role. And I think my mom just has always come off as a straight shooter. I mean, you know, no consultant shaped what she was going to say. I think she came off, and rightly so, as a very genuine person. And so people who listened to her, I think, just respected what she had to say. And it was, you know, pretty unvarnished and so on.
What did you do during the 77 campaign, besides surrogate speak? Maybe I don't remember that distinctly, but probably something of a utility infielder in the headquarters. And by October, I was really out almost constantly. I would speak several times a day here and there. I was really out a lot. And was it clear your father was going to win re-election?
No, not at all. In fact, I remember being in the headquarters on I believe it was the Friday before the election, and we had a little office pool. And so it was only on that Friday that some people were starting to say, gee, you know, we might pull this out. This is how late breaking it was. And I might have been the high guess. If I recall correctly, I think I said he would get 54%, which was seen as pretty optimistic then, and I think he won with 55.4%. So even the optimistic guesses were low.
Ray Bateman describes coming home to his own house right before the election, a day or two before, and getting his homestead rebate check, opening it up and saying, I'm going to lose the election because of this.
Mm-hmm.
Do you recall that? Not his,
yeah.
But the issue?
Sure, I recall the issue. And I think the thinking was, politically, his advisors obviously knew that that would help. But I think they thought it was fair because if he was getting criticized for the income tax, and the main purpose of the income tax was property tax relief. And if you had a choice of reminding voters of that right before the election or right after the election, it was more politically expedient to remind them before the election. And so absolutely, it made a message sink in of maybe the income tax is doing some good after all. Now, the other thing I remember is there were parts of Bergen County that normally tilted fairly Republican, but also had a lot of commuters in New York, and voted more for my father, which suggested that they understood, the economics of this thing, that the tax rebates and the income tax together were on balance a good thing for them.
Because they didn't have to pay New York income tax? This was an alternative to paying New York income tax?
Well, if you're a commuter, you're getting taxed in New York, and you're still getting a property tax rebate. So the point is that voters did the math and reacted accordingly, and on balance, that helped.
How did you regard Ray Bateman during that campaign?
As the opponent. I didn't know Ray yet, and so there was, I think it's important to note, there was never a feeling in the campaign that this was a bad guy that we had to beat. It was more about my father winning than beating up or demonizing the other guy. And the reason I make that point is because I think that's changed for the worse in New Jersey politics. Now, too often it's about demonizing. And I've gotten to know Ray since, and he's a thoroughly decent guy. He's a smart guy. He would have been a very good governor. And I've said publicly, both in his presence and in just other places, that I think Ray would have been a very good governor. And it's too bad in politics sometimes that there's not room for two people. As I say, I didn't really know him personally in the campaign, and I've gotten to know him since. And I feel really good that my father and Ray have a friendship, which again is, and a good friendship, which is all too uncommon in this state. We could use a little more of that.
The lore of the election is that Ray Bateman certainly lost the election when he came out with the Bateman-Simon plan, which your father cleverly dubbed the BS plan.
Right.
You share that memory?
Sure. Yeah, no, I remember the press conference, and calling it the BS plan was just, it was funny, it was catchy, and while you like debate to be on substance, and it really was in that campaign. I mean, they did go back and forth in a series of debates about the merits of my father's plan versus the Bateman-Simon plan. But it's also true that the BS plan was just catchy and carried a bad connotation, and that probably helped.
You never joined the administration. You must have graduated Princeton during these years. What year did you graduate Princeton?
Graduated in '76.
76.
Yeah.
What did you study at Princeton?
I majored in the Woodrow Wilson School, public policy. So I've always been interested in public policy. I never thought it was a good idea to work for my father, not that I was ever asked, but I also wanted to just do other things when I graduated from college.
What did you want to do?
I said to people at the time that I thought I wanted to do something in politics, but I had a strong instinct at that time that I still have. I said, I think more people in politics ought to understand finance. Where do I go to learn that stuff? And people said to me, an investment bank. I said, what's that? I didn't know. And so that's where I started out. I worked at what was then Solomon Brothers and learned a lot about the financial markets, became intrigued with all that, and still think that a knowledge of basic financial principles would go a long way to solving a lot of the problems we have in state government, frankly. So I'm glad that I got that experience, and it just wasn't the right time to go to work for my father. And also, working in a campaign is one thing. Working in an administration, I think would have just been a little weird. I mean, everybody, you don't want to be the kid that nobody can say no to and everybody has to treat with kid gloves and all that kind of stuff. I didn't want to live that way.
Bobby Kennedy didn't have a problem with it 10 years earlier.
Well.
But he was a brother, not a son.
Yeah, no, and that to me is a wholly different thing too. And there's a part of me that wishes there could be a little more of that, because I think there are places
more of what?
Of siblings being involved, people that are smart and that you trust. I mean, I think Bobby Kennedy was an extraordinary choice to be AG in the Kennedy administration. And you wonder, would the Cuban Missile Crisis have played out in a far worse manner had you not had that credibility that close to the president at the right degree of removal, so that it wasn't the president making any concession, so to speak, but somebody that the Russians could say, okay, we have confidence that this is really coming from, I think as the movie said, the highest authority. So having a sibling in there was, I think, a great thing for America at the time, but it's so easy to criticize that I think it's just harder and harder to do.
So you went right from Princeton to Salomon Brothers?
Mm-hmm.
Salomon Brothers became what? It doesn't exist anymore, but it was famous back then. What is it?
Yeah, it was the best trading house in the world at the time I worked there. And, you know, a lot of the people that I was a trainee under you've heard of and so on.
Such as?
A guy like a Louis Ranieri, who went on to, you know, be the force in the mortgage-backed world. A young partner on the block trading desk named Michael Bloomberg. People like that. So it was a very interesting place to be, and I feel like I learned a ton.
Does it still exist in some form, Salomon Brothers?
Not really. I mean, Salomon was taken over by Fibro, a big commodity trading firm, later became a part of Smith Barney, then Citibank, so I think it's gone through, it's morphed into too many things to really have its own identity in this day and age. But it was, as I say, a great education, and that's just what I was interested in doing at that age, and I'm glad I did. Then I did go back and get a law degree, and I practiced law for a few years, but decided I really liked the financial world better. It's just, to me, more interesting.
How long were you at Salomon Brothers?
Not that long. I basically a year, and then went off to law school.
Where'd you go to law school?
I went to Fordham, and graduated in 1981. I took this 1 year off intentionally, and then I took a second year off because it was the '77 campaign.
And where did you practice law?
I started at Mudge Rose.
Richard Nixon's firm.
Richard Nixon's firm, yeah. And
a bipartisan firm.
Oh, absolutely. And it had the best public finance practice in the country at the time I worked there. And I started working there during law school, and in fact, I guess it was my second year of law school. I worked there maybe 20 hours a week. And I had a great experience. I think the second memo I ever wrote went to the top partner in the firm, a guy named Bob Verdun. I'm sure that I was hired in part because I was the governor's kid, but I remember him saying to me, this is one of the best memos I've ever read, and I wound up just working a lot directly for him. And,
in New York?
In New York. And it was a
Where
great experience. I lived in the city. I lived in the city from the time I graduated through, I guess, 1991, when we had our second kid, and we just decided that it was time to use our house in Princeton more.
You married Barbara, who you met
in the city.
In the city?
Yep.
She too from the investment world?
Yeah, Barbara, yes, very much from the investment world, but again, didn't start out that way. I mean, she grew up in Holyoke, Massachusetts, which was basically an Irish ghetto, and she and some of her friends refer to themselves as the ghetto girls. And first one in her family to go to college, was a straight A student, scholarship student at Mount Holyoke, and came to New York, and one company offered her a job for $16,000, the other one offered her a job for $15,000, so that was easy. And
took the 16,000?
Took the 16, yep. And worked for Mobil Oil for a couple of years, and really learned the heart of the energy business was in the area that really called supply and distribution, that really ran the refineries and ran the transportation and everything. And so I guess in late '79 or '80, the energy markets were hot. Investment banks were looking to hire some more people in energy finance, and she got hired at Lehman Brothers and stayed to the bitter end, rose to vice chairman of the firm. And on the banking side, and I think is regarded as, well, Governor Corzine has introduced her as the top M&A banker on Wall Street.
She was vice chairman of Lehman Brothers at the time that Lehman Brothers finally expired.
That's
during
right.
this economic meltdown of 2008, 2009.
Correct. and was not on the trading side of the house. She was on the corporate finance side of the house, and has been an advisor to a lot of the biggest companies in the country.
And how many children do you and she have?
4.
How old?
Our oldest is 21, and our youngest is 14. So we have 3 girls and a boy.
And you live in Princeton, not far from Morven?
Correct. Yeah. Morven's an easy bike ride. I've taken my kids to see the place. They enjoyed seeing it. They were not impressed with my bedroom because it was since I was there the least, it was the smallest and has now been turned into the HVAC room. So they were not impressed with their dad's stature at the time.
When you were a young man and your father was still governor, but you were, say, a college graduate, you had the same name as the governor. Did you have political aspirations back then?
Well, yeah. I mean, I was always attracted to public policy. I mean, that was my major in college, and it wasn't because my father was the governor. It's because it's what interested me the most. So, yeah, I always thought that I would want to be involved in public sector things, and I have been in a limited way. I've tried for elective office really just once, and
when was that?
Well, I formed an exploratory committee to seek the Senate nomination back when Senator Lautenberg first stepped down. That was in early 1999, and 6 weeks after I formed the exploratory committee, there was a 2-paragraph article buried in the New York Times saying financier considering Senate bid, and that was, of course, Corzine. And it was just, it was what it was. I mean, John came in with a great resume and a lot of money, and it, needless to say, played out the way it did. So
Jim Florio challenged him that year.
Yes, yeah.
You could have joined that challenge.
I could have, but what I didn't want to do was, I wasn't going to win that. And I didn't want to be a spoiler in it, so to speak. And I also didn't want to raise money from friends for a situation that I knew just ultimately didn't make sense. And so I just thought it made sense to fold my tent and maybe try another time.
Which you may still do. I
may still do. I'm less visible than I was on the statewide stage. I think I have a decent reputation, but it's also true the more you build a business, I mean, on one hand, economically it becomes easier to do. You have more freedom, but I have a lot of clients, and I think they rely on me for things, and so we'll just see what happens down the road. I mean, I'm lucky in that I have the freedom to pretty much do what I want, and that's a nice place to be.
When you think of your father's 2 terms, what do you think were his major accomplishments?
I think a lot of things. There are substantive accomplishments, and there are accomplishments of what I might just call tone. And by tone, I mean, first of all, just a clean government, and second of all, a government that really did attract a high caliber of person, and what I was talking about before. Government a good place to get things done and make quality changes in people's lives. Substantively, I think the income tax clearly stands out. I think the Pinelands clearly stands out, the preservation of the Pinelands. I think the changes in Atlantic City are major, bringing casino gambling to Atlantic City and revitalizing what was then a dying city. Might have been done a little bit differently, but I think it was on balance a good thing for Atlantic City. The restructuring of the transportation network in the state, and
the creation of New Jersey Transit.
Yes, exactly. And so I'm sure I'm leaving out some other important things, but a lot of major structural changes in the way New Jersey government ran.
The Meadowlands?
Yeah, the Meadowlands was big. Now, the Meadowlands really started under the Cahill administration. I think the Meadowlands was much more the vision of Joe McCrane, former treasurer, than anybody. Who doesn't really get credit for it. But he was a very skilled entrepreneur. But the key financing period was right during the transition. And so by coming up with this notion of moral obligation bonds and getting New Jersey institutions to buy those bonds when Rockefeller was discouraging New York institutions from doing it, made a big difference. And without those steps, I don't think the Meadowlands would have been able to be financed.
Were those during the Cahill administration or in the early years of the Byrne administration?
It was right during the transition, and so, I think anybody who was going to look to buy bonds had to know that the new governor was committed.
How about urban policy? Did your father have any impact on the cities of New Jersey, do you think?
It's a tough question. I mean, I think yes, particularly in changing the tax structure, number one, and number two, in making it less regressive. I mean, property taxes really have, I think, choked development in our cities in a lot of ways. And number two, changing the system of education financing, I think, helped improve education in the state, particularly in the cities. And at the same time, I think the urban areas are an enormous frustration. I know my father devoted some of his, a good bit probably, of his '77 inaugural address to dealing with the cities, and some of the problems in the urban areas I just think are pretty intractable. And so, there's always more to do. I mean, I don't think my father would say that everything he would have wanted to have done in the cities occurred on his watch or since, frankly. The problems, whether in some of the schools in the urban areas, to drug use, to crime, are just ongoing battles for all of us.
Is there an area where you think he could have done more, should have done more?
Nothing in the urban areas. Nothing that
or in any area
that comes to. Well, yeah, sure. I mean, for instance, in Atlantic City, I don't know if this is practical or not. I was I don't know how old, early 20s kid, talking to him. But remember, it took 2 referenda to get casino gambling passed in Atlantic City, and
the first one failed.
Yes, I remember saying to my father, while you have the bargaining leverage, the one thing I would do is limit the amount of restaurant seats that could be inside any casino hotel. I said, force people onto the street when they're hungry. And I said, I think that'll really let 1,000 flowers bloom, if you will, in Atlantic City. Restaurants will spring up, people will be forced to go out onto the street. And I think that's key to any urban revitalization. And look, I wish that had happened. It's a detail. So I think my father would say, sure. I think any politician would say, sure. I wish there were more things I've done, things I've done differently, or things that I got done before the clock ran out.
Were there any policies of your father's that you disagreed with?
Not really. I'm trying to recall the details of the first casino referendum. I thought it was poorly structured, and I thought it would fail. I think it allowed for casinos statewide, and I thought that was a real mistake. And I thought that if the proposal had been confined to Atlantic City, since the whole idea was to revitalize that city, it would have made more sense. And why it was structured differently, at the time, I really don't recall. But yeah, I thought that was a mistake, and it played out the way I think in the right way eventually. So just a year or two delay, I guess.
Your father was an observant Catholic. Was he a practicing Catholic?
Yeah, we went to church when I was a kid. Yeah.
How was his relationship with the Catholic Church?
Well, I distinctly remember he was worried the Sunday before the election.
Which, the first or
the first? Yeah, there were all these leaflets about don't vote for Byrne because he's a pro-choice candidate and all this kind of stuff, and it worried him. And it was of no consequence politically. I mean, he won with, I guess, 70% of the vote or something like that. But it concerned him. I mean, the issue was there then as it is now. I don't think there was the same relationship between clergy and politicians then as there is now. All the stuff about certain bishops saying that they wouldn't give communion to a pro-choice politician. I don't think the issue was as sharp or divisive then as it is in a lot of places today.
So there wasn't a tension between the governor and the Catholic hierarchy?
Certainly not that I remember. If there was there might have been some, but I think it was very civil.
How much was being Irish Catholic a part of the aura of the governorship in the Byrne years? Had all recent governors been Irish Catholic?
Yeah. There seemed to be a monopoly at the time. And I think the state was a lot less ethnically diverse then than it is today. And so I don't know how much of it was coincidence, how much of it was just that, a lot of Irish went into politics. Irish are good at talking in general. And and then, even though it was a decade later, I think there was still some of the Kennedy aura that was associated with Irish politicians and so forth. So, it was there. I don't know that it was dominant in any respect.
As your father neared the end of his second term, did you think he might seek another office, an ambassadorship, a cabinet position in the federal government?
Yeah, I think it's the kind of thing that was always a possibility. Whether a federal government job or baseball commissioner. I think he would have loved to have been baseball commissioner, but so would a lot of guys. I think he would have been an outstanding federal jurist, but by the time he went out of office, Reagan was the president. And so if there had been a Democratic president when he left office, something different might have occurred. But, my father, it really is a lawyer's lawyer, and I think was just happy to go back to practicing law and being in a courtroom, which he was.
He went back to Corella Byrne?
Yes.
Which he had been part of before governorship,
no.
Or he went...
Yeah, I don't know if I mentioned Charlie before, but Charlie was one of the people who had been a chief of staff. They grew up together professionally, certainly, and close personally, and so they went into law practice. Charlie had the firm, and my father joined it after he left office.
I think your father was still governor when the arena in the Meadowlands was named Brendan Byrne Arena, or did it happen right after he left,
I can't remember, honestly, but, it was either right before or right after.
Was, in retrospect, was that an appropriate decision by the Sports Authority to name that building for your father?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I guess there is some feeling that you shouldn't name stuff for people till after they're dead. On the other hand, we have the Richard Cody Arena in West Orange. We have the Frank Lautenberg train station. And I think there was a feeling at the time that my father named it after himself, which really is not at all true. What is true is that he appointed some or all of the board members, and they thought it would be a nice thing to do, a nice gesture. Just like Lautenberg had a lot to do with the transportation. You name something for somebody in the area that they were particularly influential in establishing. And so I'd say two things. First of all, a lot of people were upset when it was named for him, and I understand that. I mean, people think that politicians are all about memorializing themselves and publicity and all that sort of thing. And at the same time, it was interesting that when the name was changed from Brendan Byrne Arena to Continental Arena, people seemed equally upset, thought it was not a particularly nice thing to do. And so
Christy Whitman did.
Yeah, it was interesting to see the public reaction that was very sympathetic to my father after the initial reaction, which was not. The other thing that I would say, and I frankly have no idea if this is apocryphal or true, but it's good either way. There was, I understood that they wanted to name, one of the buildings at the complex after Cahill, and the joke was that you couldn't really name the arena after Cahill and then call the racetrack Byrne Downs.
Did you have a view when Christy Whitman, I guess the rationale for taking your father's name off the arena was we can get some money for
Right.
this if we sell the naming rights, but there was also a thought that this was a way of insulting your father at a time when there was some disagreement between her and him over Bob Mulcahy's stature or status as CEO of the Sports Authority.
Yeah.
What was your view of what really happened there?
Well, I mean, look, I didn't think it was very nice at the time. Financially, I thought it was really sort of a drop in the bucket. And
what did they get, about $30 million over 10 years?
$30 million, but it was, I think, 15 in free airline tickets and 15 cash, so I'm not sure that the other 15 ever really counted for much. And so again, that's where I go back to my thing about more people who are in politics or who cover it being a little financially sophisticated. I don't think it was ever really a $30 million number. So, look, I didn't think it was a particularly nice thing to do, but I think at this stage of the game, everybody sort of let bygones be bygones. And I know that my father and Christy Whitman have sat down and have had pleasant conversations since. And I frankly think it's more important that people in this business on different sides of the aisle get along. And so I think they do now, and that's good.
You like Morven. Morven was the governor's mansion, and then Drumthwacket nearby became the governor's mansion during the Kane years, I
Correct.
believe. Did that seem like a logical thing to you?
Well, yeah, I think it was logical. And it was my father's decision. And it was his decision because just like you can't have a pay raise, you can't enact a pay raise on your own watch. There was a similar feeling about a change in the House. And the reason for it is because Drumthwacket is bigger, and it was easier you really couldn't have a cabinet meeting around the breakfast table in Morven. It just wasn't that big a house, and Drumthwacket has bigger rooms, easier to entertain in the wintertime. Most of the entertaining at Morven was in the nice weather and in a tent out in the back. And so Drumthwacket, you could really do more inside. So it was practical. I think that Morven is a warmer, cozier house, if you will. Drumthwacket is pretty, it's stately, the grounds are nice, but if I were a private citizen and both houses were on the market, I'd rather have Morven.
There was reference before we began this interview to an anecdote involving the Yankees. No?
Oh,
that was the dog?
yeah, the dog. Oh, we had a dog named Yankee.
Oh, you had a dog named Yankee?
Yeah.
Well, your father was that much of a Yankee fan that he named his dog Yankee?
I don't know if it was Yankee in the sense of the Yankees or Yankee more in the sense of Yankee Doodle.
Ah, okay.
But in any circumstance, I think this dog figured out that he was a special dog and living in a special place, and he carried on. Yankee was an aristocrat, more than any of the rest of us.
You referred to what extent do you recall celebrities that you may have met through your father during
No,
those
I
years?
recall him, sure.
Who?
A range. Jimmy Carter, when he was seeking support for the Democratic nomination, passed through town, spent a night at Morven. I got to meet him when he was the governor of Georgia. I got to meet certain senior staffers. I mean, I believe Jody Powell was there, and he was just a young guy in a campaign at the time. So it was interesting to meet a guy who we all knew could be a future president. I remember Cardinal Minzenti from who was one of the Catholic prelates from the Eastern Bloc, who was one of the staunch foes of communism at the time, came through. I remember meeting a delegation of senior Chinese university presidents and faculty, and I actually was asked to give them a tour around the Princeton campus, which was kind of fun. I remember Princess Grace coming for lunch, and my sister Susan and I were seated at a table with Princess Caroline and Prince Albert, and you could feel everybody looking over what's going on, anything good happening over there. And other people. My father played in this RFK pro celebrity tournament, and so I got to meet a number of the Kennedys and so forth.
Which ones?
Well, I met Caroline. I mean, we had dinner one night together at one of the parties at a dinner before the tournament.
Where was the tournament?
The tournament was at I can't remember if it was at Forest Hills or the new U.S. Tennis Center, honestly, but it was at one of the two, wherever they played the U.S. Open at the time. And I thought she was a delight. And I got to know. I remember running into Maria a few years later, and hey, and
that would
so
be Maria
Shriver,
Schwarzenegger.
yeah, Schwarzenegger, right? And so I mean, I'm not friends with them, but I got to know them, and I got exposure to just a lot of interesting people that passed through the place. And for me, that was one of the fun aspects. And in fact, when people say, was it bad to have your parents living so close to you in college, the answer was no, it was good, because I could be home literally in 5 minutes if there was a reason to be. So, for me, those were all very, very interesting times and interesting opportunities.
Any Hollywood types?
Yeah. Pat Boone and Debbie Boone were there one day, and we were playing tennis. And again, I just thought they were delightful people. I thought Debbie Boone was as nice as she could be.
What were your father's outside interests when he wasn't being governor or in that mental mode? What interested him?
He liked to get exercise, and he loved to play tennis. And he was a sprinter in college, so he was very fast on a tennis court, and liked baseball, and really loved baseball almost to the exclusion of other sports. Would take me to baseball games outside of New York when I was a little kid. The World Series, maybe in '67, was in Baltimore, and we went down there. He wouldn't take me to a basketball or hockey game, but we'd go to baseball games anywhere. And
had he played baseball?
Not seriously. And he liked to read, stuff like that. And a people person, just always a lot of people around.
Opera?
Yeah, he really likes opera, and he had an amazing friendship with Maria Yuritsa, who was probably the most noted diva of the 20s and 30s, and she was a fabulous woman. I mean, I only have somewhat vague recollections of her, but Jeritza, I believe, and I know that I attended an opera with her once, and when she walked into the room as a rather old woman, but extraordinarily elegant, the place just stopped. I mean, everybody knew when she walked into the hall, and she was just a larger-than-life personality, and I can't remember how she and my father became friends, but they just hit it off, and she was a wonderful woman. And again, this is not the normal exposure for a kid in his early 20s. I remember sitting at a football game once, and who's sitting next to me was in a box, but who's there but Otto Preminger. And so Preminger and I got in a long conversation. He knew nothing about football. I explained the rules to him. And he said, call me for lunch sometime. So we went out for probably a 3.5-hour lunch one day. And it was, again, it was an extraordinary experience.
Your father, and I want to get to this, is famous today for being so funny. Did he have an interest in comics and comedians? Did they come through as well?
Not really. No, I mean, my father was always naturally a quick-witted guy, and my grandfather was a great speaker and more of a storyteller than a one-liner type, but a very entertaining guy, and my grandfather was very much an extrovert. What's interesting to me is that in my father's first term, this is something about, selective memory, I guess. My father's first term, I think he was largely depicted as dour and not particularly funny. And privately, I always knew that he was. And when there were headlines or news stories saying that he wasn't, it always amused me. But publicly, he was not that great a speaker at the outset. But the first signs of humor, I guess, were when he referred to himself as the oratorical equivalent of a blocked punt. And I think just time in office, naturally you speak enough and your ability publicly improves. I also think that during the 77 campaign, there was almost a devil-may-care attitude. So things that he might have said privately that occurred to him that were funny, he just started to say publicly, and it grew from there.
How are we doing on time? 13?
13 minutes to go.
You referred to your grandfather. Tell us about Francis Byrne.
Yeah.
His name? Francis, what? What was that middle initial?
Francis Aloysius Byrne.
Aloysius?
Yeah.
Did you know him?
Sure. And he was, I think he was the chairman or something of West Orange's centenary committee in maybe 1965 or something like that. So West Orange had a commission form of government, but he was, at least for part of his life, the de facto mayor. I mean, under a different system of government. Everybody knew him. He was, he also served in county positions. He was on the Essex County Tax Board and things like that. And he was just an affable guy that knew everybody, had an interest in the theater, which may explain some of my father's interest in opera, which extends to theater and Broadway plays, by the way. My father loves to sing Broadway show tunes and stuff like that. Anyway, my grandfather was a local politician. He was an insurance sales guy as well, but loved politics, and if I recall correctly, died shortly before my father got elected in '73, but I think died knowing that his kid was going to be the governor.
And his wife?
Genevieve. Genevieve Brennan was her maiden name, and there were a lot of Brennans in the Orange area, and later migrated to West Orange. And as I say, they were really a fairly prominent family in Orange in the late 1800s. And there was some kind of epidemic, I don't know if it was flu or some other thing, that the move even a mile away to West Orange was a little bit up the hill and fresher air, and that's part of the reason they migrated to West Orange. But I think they met in some theater production or something like that. I was in my, as I say, I was about 19. They died at similar times, not too far apart from each other. So, but I knew them through my teenage years, and so I feel blessed for that I had that much time with grandparents.
How many children did they have?
5. My father was fourth out of 5 kids. And
your uncles and aunts?
Yeah, oh sure. No, and we had family gatherings at holidays, particularly Thanksgiving and other times of the year. So no, I grew up with a lot of cousins and all that sort of stuff. A pretty good sense of extended family, and that was fun.
Tell us about your mother's family.
My mother's family has been in New Jersey since before the Revolution.
What's her maiden name?
Her maiden name is Featherly.
Featherly?
Yeah. My grandfather was George Featherly, and I knew my great-grandmother on that side, my grandmother's mother, who lived in Canada, and her name was Chrysler, and before that, the name, the previous generation, was Drummond. And if you go to the Canadian side of Niagara Falls, the main street is Drummond Avenue, and so, they came early.
Chrysler was one of the names?
Yes.
Any relation to the automobile Chrysler?
I guess, not that I'm aware of, and I guess it's past the stage where it's worth finding out.
And where did your mother grow up?
West Orange. My father was a senior and she was a sophomore, and she was voted at the, I don't know if they still do this in high school yearbooks, but she was voted the best looking girl in her class, and there you go.
Did she have siblings?
My mom had one older sister, and I have 3 cousins on that side of the family.
So your father and mother were high school sweethearts? Is that what you're telling us?
They knew each other in high school. I don't think they ever really dated seriously, but my mother was good friends with my father's younger sister, and so they were around each other a lot. And
your father went to Princeton. Did your mother go to college?
yeah, my mom went to Bucknell and then got a master's at NYU and taught. I think was teaching 2nd grade and overheard one of her 2nd graders whispering to a friend that Mrs. Byrne is pregnant, but she doesn't know it yet. And a few months later, I came along.
Mrs. Byrne is pregnant. I don't get it. How could she be pregnant and not know it?
Well,
yet?
no, the 2nd graders were wiser than the adults.
Really?
Yeah, this little 2nd grader knew what was going on, even though my mom apparently didn't. So.
Talk about, from your vantage point, about your father's post-gubernatorial life. He's the most celebrated after-dinner speaker on the political dinner circuit in this state. He's pretty active in public affairs in this state as a I guess an interviewee in the Star Ledger and on NJN.
Mm-hmm.
How do you view what he's evolved into? What is he today?
Well, a senior statesman, I guess, is the easiest way to put it. Still goes to his law firm, almost every day. And, I think at this stage he's certainly not a litigator. He's not in court or doing any of that anymore. But I think he's just a senior counselor. And, for a while was on a number of boards, and I think most of them have age limits, so that's changed. But I think just a senior statesman in state politics, dispensing advice, and just helping people who he cares about, and just enjoying being around people, and I think by and large enjoying doing some of the after dinner stuff. I think it's just fun for him.
Do you enjoy hearing the jokes?
Sure. I mean, I know most of them by now, but sure I do.
We all do. How long were you Democratic State Chairman?
3.5 years. I came in after Governor Florio lost in his reelection bid to Christie Whitman, and I think there was a feeling in the Democratic Party that it was just time for some new leadership and some new faces and so on. And so my name just kind of emerged out of a pack, if you will. And so the initial term was 2 years, and then the way the party bylaws worked, another 1.5-year term, which I served during the Clinton re-election and through the Democratic gubernatorial primary. And when McGreevey became the nominee, well, I frankly resigned, but I was going to be booted anyway, and that's normal enough.
Who succeeded you?
Tom Giblin did, and I think a lot of the reason for that is, and Giblin and I are friends. I think a lot of the reason for that is, whether in the case of McGreevey appointing Giblin or Jim Florio appointing Lesniak, a lot of times the state chairman in a gubernatorial cycle is sort of the caboose, the last one on the train that made it all happen, and that's pretty big reward. So anyway, when McGreevey became the nominee, that was the end of my time as party chairman.
Did you accomplish, what did you accomplish as party chairman?
Well, I felt that we accomplished a fair amount. I like to think that I helped plant a lot of seeds, if you will, around the state. that I helped a lot of bright young people get a start in politics. We went around as a state party and did a lot of training sessions locally, just giving people advice on how to run effective campaigns. I put money into parts of the state where, frankly, some people got mad at me, but where Democrats are winning elections now that we weren't 10 years ago. I like to think that I helped craft the party's message, and I sat in on a lot of the party caucuses in the Assembly and in the Senate. I had my frustrations. I really spoke out as actively as I could, for instance, on the pension bonds that I thought then and think now were not a good thing for the state of New Jersey. We didn't have the votes in the legislature to stop that from going forward. I did talk to the candidates for governor who were running at the time, and I said, you guys ought to have a joint press conference and say, look, one of us is bound to get elected sometime during the life of these bonds, and they're subject to appropriation bonds, and we make no representation that will seek the appropriation necessary to pay them, so buyer beware, which I think would have killed it. I don't think any prudent investor, anybody subject to those fiduciary standards, could have then bought the bonds, but I didn't have my way on that one. And you know, I must say I've been disappointed at some of the directions that the party has gone since my time.
You said that you're not entirely happy with the direction that the Democratic Party has gone since you stepped down as party chairman. Amplify, please.
Well, it's funny, you know, a lot of casual observers of politics say that there's no difference between the Democrats and the Republicans and all that sort of thing. I mean, I think there are vast differences, number one. And number two, maybe I'm too close to it, but I think there are real differences between the Democratic Party nationally and the Democratic Party in the state. I mean, the Democratic Party nationally, under Bill Clinton, was fiscally responsible. I mean, they were progressive, but they were fiscally responsible. They're the ones that balance the budget. And similarly, Obama, we're in early days of Obama, and we're not balancing the budget, but we are responding in an aggressive way to a difficult economic crisis. We're being proactive at a time where I think that's called for. So I've been happy with the Democrats nationally. The Democrats in the state, I don't think have been good fiscal stewards. You know, I was never happy with either the prospect of a McGreevey administration or the actual administration. I don't think they were particularly responsible fiscal stewards. I frankly think that that whole administration was largely the product of a business syndicate rather than a vision of what was best for New Jersey. I mean, that was the roots of that campaign, I'm sorry to say. And so I think New Jersey is in worse shape economically and fiscally than it was 10 or 15 years ago. And, you know, in the last 2 or 3 years, that's true of a lot of states. But I don't think we have been exemplary leaders on a number of fronts. I had dinner with one of the senior Democrats in the legislature not too long ago, and he shakes his head and he says, nothing we're doing is working. And I don't want to say who it was, but somebody's very respected. And, you know, I think on education policy, we're putting a lot of money into schools, and a lot of kids, particularly in the cities, aren't getting a good education. I had lunch with you know, one of the more influential people in education in the state not long ago, and he was saying that you know, there's not enough accountability in the system, that aside from not being able to get rid of incompetent teachers, we're not even doing peer evaluations. The kind of thing where teachers could sit down with each other and talk about goal setting and you know, how to improve performance in an individual school. Even that seems out of bounds. And so, you know, much less the broader issue of getting kids out of failing schools. If kids aren't learning in places, I have the luxury, as somebody who's relatively well off, of saying this school's not working for my kid, I'm going to send him somewhere else. I think that urban parents ought to have the same opportunity, and more Democrats are coming to that point of view. But as a party, we're not where we ought to be yet. On any number of other issues, I feel the same way. I think that under both Democratic and Republican governors, the whole pension system has gotten out of control to nobody's advantage, Michael. And what I mean to nobody's advantage, people are promised a level of benefits, and so they feel good that their union leadership has delivered these benefits to them and so on. But nobody's looking at the underlying funding. So, for instance, in the past fiscal year, the state contributed, I believe it was $2.2 billion in for pension benefits and post-retirement health care. Actuarially, that number should have been $7.2 billion, so a $5 billion shortfall in 1 year in what the state should put in. Now, in the context of a $30 billion budget, if Jim Florio got in hot water politically for a $2.8 billion tax increase, you think that we're going to pass a $5 billion tax increase solely for the purpose of funding state employee pensions? At some point, we've got to deal more realistically with this issue. And I've said that I feel sorry for the 40-year-old state worker who goes to Trenton every day, does an honest day's work, and thinks he's got all these benefits at the end of the rainbow, because financially the numbers just don't add up. So there are a number of places where I just don't think we're getting the job done.
You wrote an op-ed piece to this effect about 6 months ago that seemed to have an impact in Trenton. What kind of feedback have you gotten to your sounding the alarm?
Well, a lot of people in both parties said they told me that they thought it was spot on and that it addressed the issue more clearly than they'd seen in print. So I hope to have some influence on the debate and, hopefully moving things in a direction of, being more responsible and dealing with these issues. I opened that op-ed with recalling that when I was a little kid, I read an article saying that if you were in a rowboat a quarter mile above Niagara Falls and you rowed as hard as you could, it was too late, that the current was going to take you over. And I said, nobody really knows where New Jersey is right now. We don't know if we're an eighth of a mile up or a half mile up or what, but we're getting dangerously close to a point of no return, to what you might call a tipping point, where CEOs of companies look at New Jersey and say, even with the advantages, the proximity to ports, the proximity to New York City, a wealthy state, a good consumer market, it's just not worth putting new jobs there. There are too many disadvantages. Where existing people who are wealthy say, I'm not sure I want to stay here. I may change my domicile, which you can do just by being out of the state for half a year. So I know a lot of people who I see on the street who are not New Jersey residents anymore for tax purposes. And so I worry about sort of the slow but pernicious effect on our state and its economy over time if we don't deal with some of these issues that we just really need to grapple with.
Would you cut the income tax? Would you cut corporate taxes? What do you see as a useful tool right now to try to reverse the trend you're describing?
Frankly, if I were running for office, I would start on the other side of the coin. I think part of the reason we're in so much trouble is every politician talks about cutting taxes. And nobody wants to talk about cutting spending. And what I would do is say, look, these are spending areas that I really want to address. And let's deal with that first and see how much we can save and cut taxes accordingly. And so I have talked about the two key issues really being the price per unit of service in the state and the level of services that we really want and can afford in the state. And as to the latter question, it's common that everybody wants more services but doesn't want to pay for them. I mean, one of my father's great stock lines is, if you're not getting something for nothing, you're not getting your fair share. And that sums up the problem that we have in the state in a pretty pithy way. But I look at my hometown of Princeton. A starting patrolman earns 71% more than a starting patrolman in the city of Trenton. I mean, that tells me there's some inefficiency in that market when guys doing essentially the same job, or frankly the job in Trenton I would think is more dangerous. So how does a guy in Princeton get paid 71% more? And they both, I believe, get paid more than a New York City cop. And so when I talk about the price per unit of service, I'm talking about are salaries in the public sector really at a market level, or are they at some artificially inflated level? I had a town manager tell me that the all-in cost for having a guy to mow the lawn is $75,000, which seems like a high price to pay to have one guy mowing lawns in town. And so I think we have to deal with the cost per unit of service. Now that's going to get into some tougher questions over time. I had a former state treasurer tell me that we're not going to deal with New Jersey's property taxes until we start tackling issues such as class size. Now, what parent wants to hear about one or two more kids in their kid's class in school? But this comes down to level of services. Can mean anything from the really difficult questions of class size or how many cops there are going to be on a street in a given town, to some of the simpler things that we really ought to be able to fix starting right now. I love walking in the parks in Princeton in September, and there's a guy with a leaf blower going around, which is very nice, except that no leaves are down yet, so why are we paying for a guy to clean the leaves? I think it requires a little bit of just attention to detail to go around and saying, are the costs that we're incurring here really necessary? And I think you've got to be sort of out in front of it, ahead of the curve on what I call the big ticket items in state government, which are clearly education, public safety, the cost of benefits, post-retirement health care and the pension system, the health care costs in the form of Medicaid, and a few other places are really the big tickets. You're not going to ever solve the state budget situation by laying off another 1,000 employees in Trenton. The numbers simply don't add up, and it's time we get real about this and have a serious discussion. The kind of discussion that my father and Ray Bateman had on the campaign trail in 1977. It wasn't name-calling, it wasn't about personalities, it was about, hey, we've got some tough issues. And in '77, my father went around saying, you may not like me, but take a look at this alternative. It doesn't make sense for A, B, and C reasons. And the debate was on the issues. And New Jersey could use more of that.
Having watched the governorship for 30, 35 years, what's your view on New Jersey adding a lieutenant governor in this election cycle?
Well, it depends how it plays out. I mean, on one level, New Jersey voters complain that we have too much government and too much bureaucracy, and the first thing we do when we got a problem is to have another bureaucracy. And so now that that's the reality, you make the best of it, and I think there are places that a lieutenant governor could play an influential role in dealing with some of the problems that I've just outlined. A lieutenant governor could easily be the point person on economic development for the state, so that a CEO or somebody who's talking about moving jobs into the state has somebody at a very high and credible level that they could talk to and get stuff done and move the bureaucracy. A lieutenant governor could play a key role in dealing with some of these budgetary issues, and dealing with the legislature in not only crafting the proposals but getting them enacted. So there are a lot of places where I think a lieutenant governor could play a very constructive role, and so the remaining question is, what kind of person are we going to put in the job? Are we going to put somebody in who just helps on the ticket, or are we going to put somebody in who really could play an effective role as a lieutenant governor and credibly step into the top job if necessary? So it's an open question.
Sounds like we should look into the legislature then for that person, if that person is going to be interacting with the legislature.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, I think there are credible choices there, but I wouldn't confine it to that. I think there are people who are mayors, who would be equally competent in dealing with the legislature. I think there are people in private law practice, for instance, who do that. Harold Hodis was incredibly competent, I think, at dealing with members of the legislature, and he'd never, served there. So I think the choices are broader, but certainly people within the legislature, certain of them would be good choices.
Some people who think seriously about state government think we need a full-time legislature in the state of New Jersey. Do you have any view on that, one way or the other?
Yeah, I have mixed views on that. I think a legislature ought to meet more in more concentrated sessions. I think there is value to opportunities for legislators to gather more informally and sit down and hash things out and see if they can reach compromises. And by having them, as other states do, in the Capitol for a concentrated period of time, rather than just on a Monday and a Thursday, I think can make a difference. I'm not sure that full-time itself is a panacea. I think the danger of that is you could have full-time legislators sitting around thinking, okay, how am I going to justify my full-time? How am I going to get my name in the paper? And there are times that you come up with proposals with unintended consequences that maybe aren't so good. And so I don't see it as a panacea. One thing I've thrown out there, and I don't mean it to be too mischievous, but if we're going to have a full-time legislature that gets paid more and is there more, do we do it by, and we want to have some efficiency, do we do it by cutting the size of the legislature in half? Which is just going back to where we were in the 1960s. We had 21 senators and I guess it was 40 members of the Assembly. So why not pay them double and have half as many? It seemed to work very well for the state to have that size legislature in the early days. And there's an argument that it might be better because governors don't have to satisfy this or that special interest to get important legislation through.
Our county chairs, sometimes we who look at New Jersey state government think county chairs somehow get in the way with their demands for political patronage and their amassing of power. How do you see their role in going forward in state politics, and what should it be?
Well, first of all, there's nothing new about what you just said. I mean, we were talking earlier about the income tax, and it was a change, I guess, one county chairman in Essex County back in the mid-'60s that derailed a state income tax bill that was supposed to pass during the Hughes administration. And so, yeah, I mean, there are a wide range of county chairmen. Harry Pazicki, who has a well-deserved reputation as an effective reformer, was a county chairman and did some good things, briefly, but did a lot to democratize Middlesex County and to open it up and have county conventions and so forth. So that's one kind of county chairman. There are others that, shall we say, are less admirable. I think the broader issue, when I speak to college kids, I say that if you want to vote 10 times, have 10 times the influence that you currently have, vote in a primary, because the turnout is so low that you'd have that much more influence. And I'm hoping that with the internet, that makes it easier to know about candidates and where they stand, and on Facebook you get a reminder, hey guys, today's election day, don't forget to vote. I'm hoping that increases participation of voters, not just young, but of everybody, in primaries. And by definition, that would dilute the influence of county chairmen. I mean, this interview was supposed to be about my father's days, and so it reminds me of the story that when he was campaigning, I guess it was on the Point Pleasant Boardwalk in 1973, Memorial Day weekend, May of '73. He goes up to some lady, I'm Brendan Byrne, running in the Democratic primary for governor, hope you'll support me. And the lady says, I'm from Hudson County, I think we're all ready for you. And so there are people, the point of the story is, aside from its humor, is there are people who are always going to follow the organization line, and they tend to show up and vote in If participation in primaries were broader, you would have people voting who were voting based on making up their own minds and evaluating things rather than voting at the direction or the whim of a county chair. And so if New Jerseyans want a different type of public servant, they really ought to pay more attention to primary elections.
Has the role of the state party chairs changed in the 12 years or so since you left it?
Well, I mean, the first distinction may not be toward your question. I mean, there's obviously a difference between an out-of-power chairman, one where you're the head of a party that doesn't have the governor, as I was, and one who's in power. So Joe Cryan is the chairman today, and a lot of his job is to act as an advocate and so on for the administration. Beyond that, I don't know that the role has changed that much. I mean, you're to be a spokesman, you're to be a fundraiser, you're to be a fireman, if you will, and by that I mean somebody who puts out little fires in the form of political disputes before they become big fires. And so, at some level, I think that the influence of county chairmen, and therefore the state party organization, is stronger now than it was during my time. They are centers of fundraising. The current political rules allow county political organizations to have a huge financial influence on elections. There are still rules that allow county organizations to design ballots such that their favored choices have an edge in primaries and so forth. And so I would like to see a trend toward greater democratization in primaries, as I said. And I think one of the problems we have in politics, both at the state and the national level, is because of the limited constituencies that vote in primaries, the Democrats tend to nominate people who are often far left of center, and the Republicans nominate people who are far right of center, and then it comes time to govern, and people complain that there's too much acrimony in politics and these people don't get along. It's partly because we don't nominate enough people who are in the middle of the spectrum and who can forge a dialogue and find areas of compromise. And so, dealing with some of these complex fiscal areas, it's very hard for a Democrat to be nominated on a platform of changing some of our fiscal practices when the primaries are so heavily dominated by public employee unions. And I think that they would be better served by somebody who says it's time to get real about this kind of stuff, or a lot of your own members, when they retire, aren't going to have what they thought they did. But it doesn't make it any easier to get nominated, and I think that's a real problem for us.
You have 6 siblings who had the same experience you did, the 8 years of being the children of the governor. Where are they today? What are they up to?
Well, I'll go in order. I'm the oldest, and I've been politically involved and run a pretty successful investment management business. My next sibling is my sister Susan, who died tragically about 2 years ago, and who was a very, very smart woman and a very talented artist and photographer and so on. My sister Nancy was, until a few months ago, the director of travel and tourism in the state, and I think eventually got frustrated and stepped out. And she's living down in Monmouth County and is happy and doing great. And my brother Tim is an attorney he lives in Princeton, but he works in Manhattan, so he spends a good amount of the week up there. And my next sister is Mary Ann, who was born mentally retarded and doesn't even speak. I mean, she's pretty severely retarded. And when I go to see her, it's hard for me to know if I'm her brother or just a free ticket to a vanilla milkshake. But she's, except when she's in some degree of physical pain, and seems to be pretty happy and gets along with the other people in her unit, which is a terrific place in South Plainfield. And Then my sister Barbara is number 6, and she's living up in Cohasset, Massachusetts, and has 2 young children, and taught school, and is now doing some admissions work for MIT, and I think as her kids get older wants to get back more actively into education, either as a teacher or administrator. And then the youngest is my brother Bill, who has 2 young girls, and he lives up in Maplewood. So the furthest away is Boston, so we all still see each other a lot, which is nice.
And your mother, your parents divorced after the governorship?
Yes.
In the 80s, I guess?
Either the late 80s or early 90s, I forget.
And where's your mother today?
My mom still lives in the house that they moved into after they left Morven, and in Princeton. My brother lives right down the block, my brother Tim, and you know, we're only about 2 miles away, I guess. So you know, we see my mom a lot, which is great. My mom's great.
And how about your kids? 21, ranging down to 14. What are they doing and exhibiting signs of interest in?
Well, my oldest daughter, Megan, is 21, and she just finished her junior year at Princeton University. And she is majoring in religion and seems very, very interested in the entertainment world. Worked for a producer out in Hollywood last summer and is going to do something similar this summer. And my next daughter, Aron, is 18, and she will be a freshman at Princeton in the fall. And she's an extraordinarily talented artist, and is very interested in anything from art to design. You know, where she goes with it, who knows? But she could be outstanding as an architect, but she could be outstanding as an urban planner. She could be outstanding as the head of a retail organization. We'll see where she goes. My son Brendan III, is finishing up his sophomore year at the Lawrenceville School, and he's really an outstanding student in history. I mean, just has taught history classes to kids a year or 2 younger than him. They let him do some teaching, and he's just an encyclopedia. He seems interested in you know, military stuff too, and you know, again, he's young, so who knows where he goes. We have a friend who's was very senior in the CIA, and we ask if Brendan's involved, and she says, I can't comment on that. Our youngest daughter, Kelly, is 14, is finishing her freshman year in high school, and is a very extroverted, funny kid. I could see her being a TV host someday. I mean, I think she's she could host a TV talk show, and if the guest were mute, she'd carry the hour herself. So you know, who knows what she'll want to do? But they're all great kids, and we feel lucky to have 4 of them.
Interesting that you wanted to get an hour away, at least an hour away from home when you went off to college, and your 2 college-age kids are going to Princeton.
Yeah.
And you're just a mile away.
Oh, we're 2 miles away, so that makes a big difference now. Look, it's a great school, and they both made their own decisions, but the one thing that I was able to tell them is that I wasn't looking forward to having my parents there, but once they got there, it was no big deal, and it really didn't affect my life, and I think they would say the same. You know, my daughter Megan, who is there, I have lunch with maybe once a month, and it's always, you know, when she wants to. And so, you know, the one thing is I don't cross the street and go on campus all that much because I don't want her running into Dad all the time. I'm a trustee of one campus organization, the student organization that does, you know, everything from mock trial to model Congress to model UN, and I've been a trustee of that for years. And so, you know, I'm on campus for, you know, occasional things, but not that much. So I don't see them that much, and in some ways I say, you know, if you were away and we came up for Parents' Weekend, you'd have to be with us constantly for 12 or 20, you know, 12 hours for 2 days in a row. This way, you have lunch and go back to your own thing.
So last question. Was Brendan Byrne the best governor since 1947 under the new setup?
Well, I think so, but I think I'm entitled, right, Michael? Come on. Look, I think the state's had a lot of very good governors. I think that we have had a number of people who really were visionaries and who were great stewards of the state, and and so forth. But yeah, I think my father is right up there, and I know a number of other people have said that they think he's the best governor that we've had since Woodrow Wilson. I'm immensely proud of him, but I'll leave final judgment to others.
Thanks very much, Tom.
Thanks.